All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mirantis Labs Tech Talks, where we dive into cloud native topics, use cases, tutorials, and many more to educate you all. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Avinash Desireddy, a Senior Solutions Architect and Developer Advocate here at Mirantis. I'm your host today, and joining me, Nick Chase, Director of Technical Marketing at Mirantis, to talk about like YAML concepts and how it is used in different configuration systems, definitions, and other purposes in many other tools. Uh, Nick Chase, can you tell me about yourself and who are Mirantis?
Sure. So, other than the people who pay me, so Mirantis is the open cloud company. We do Kubernetes, we do OpenStack, we support Lens. Lens. Um, anyway, um, we are basically committed to helping you to have your cloud applications in any environment run appropriately. We enable developers and innovators to create extraordinary products and services by enabling and automating the discovery and integration and configuration of the right open source products for their unique needs. That is Mirantis. As far as myself, I am a former developer. I'm an author. I've written a bunch of books, done a bunch of different things. You name it, I have probably done it. I'm also a former teacher and all of that. But the main thing that I am passionate about is helping people to understand how to use different technologies. And that is kind of the core of where we are with this today, which is you really can't use Kubernetes some um, without having some notion of YAML and how it works and what it is and all of that. So that's what we're doing today. Um, so a little bit of housekeeping before we go on. Did you want to do the housekeeping, Avinash, or you want me to do it?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah. So if you have any questions, go ahead and submit them. It says in the questions panel. I haven't used this interface before. I assume that means in the chat in this case, or is there a separate place, Avinash, for questions?
Uh, so just in the chat, there are like three different sections: general Q&A and DMs. Please use the Q&A section to post any questions,
Oh,
and chat
there it is.
window
Right,
for the
of course.
conversations.
Fabulous. Okay. All right. So there we go. And good morning
And
to everyone as well. Who
yes,
said that?
good morning to everyone. And after the session, you will be receiving an email with the slides, recording information. So with that, we can get started.
All right, fabulous. So let's kind of get a level set. We are going to be talking about some Kubernetes concepts. You do not have to be a Kubernetes expert. If you are, great. You will recognize these concepts. If you're not, don't worry about it. It's okay. We're going to talk about some basic objects. This is not a Kubernetes tutorial. So if that's why you're here, you're in the wrong place. But you might as well stick around because you're going to need this to learn Kubernetes anyway. All right. So agenda. This is what we're going to be talking about. We'll start out by just sort of talking about why you would use YAML, some places that you might see it. Overall structural concepts. It's a pretty straightforward structure, so we'll go over that. We'll talk about the data types, and then we'll look at some tools. Okay. Let's start with uses for YAML. So in terms of uses, there's basically two different places that you'll see YAML um, being used. One would be for configurational type things, And that's the kind of thing that you see in places like Kubernetes or Swarm. And the other is for like templates for um, for what you want to create. So things like OpenStack, Ansible, Maven will use YAML for their templates. So let's take a look at just sort of a sample of how it might look. So for example, this is how you define a pod in Kubernetes. So a pod is, and can you guys see my cursor here? I don't want to kind of like keep pointing to things if you can't see it. Can you see my cursor?
Yes, I
Yes.
can see
Okay.
it.
Fabulous. Okay. So as you can see here, we're defining a pod, a Kubernetes pod, and we're giving information about that pod. So that is how YAML is used in Kubernetes, where we define objects and we give information about them and what's in them. So we have a pod. This is the metadata about the pod, and then we're defining that pod itself. So what containers are in it, and information about those containers. So that's one example. Whereas in Swarm, we are listing the different services that we're creating. So we're creating a web service, and here's the image that we're using to pull it. And then we have the Redis service, and it's got a different image, and so on. Whereas we come over here to OpenStack, a heat template looks completely different. But same thing, we're specifying different parameters, different resources, and so on. And you're probably kind of getting the idea that these YAML files, while they have a common format, are not necessarily the same. So like this would be a Maven one, is very simple. It's just basically name, value, name, value, name, value. Okay. All right. So what makes a YAML document? As you noticed, there's no specific vocabulary here. Okay. There's no artifact ID in Kubernetes. There's no action in Kubernetes, but there's but that's what you need for Ansible. OpenStack has its own vocabulary. Swarm has its own vocabulary, but they all have one thing in common, which is they have a specific type of formatting. You see these indents, and these indents are predictable, and that is the crux of YAML: name, value, and predictable indenting. At the heart of it, that's it. It's really that simple. I know it's crazy, but it's true. So um, those are the things that make a YAML document. Now, obviously, there's a little bit more to it than that, but not much. Okay. Um, so let's look at the kind of overall structure. So this is a very, very simple YAML document. This is this is an associative array. Uh, name, value is Nginx, name is image, value is Nginx 1.10. Okay, very simple. This is a fully formed YAML document. This is also a fully formed YAML document. This is what it would look like in JSON, but YAML is a superset of JSON. So basically, every valid JSON document is also a YAML document. So if you're tired of dealing with all of this and you just want to go ahead and say, I'm just going to do everything in JSON, go ahead. You'll still have to read everybody else's YAML, but you won't have to deal with it. So basically, this YAML is the same as this JSON version. Okay, obviously the JSON version more verbose, but that's the idea. Now, sometimes it's useful. Okay, for example, in this case, I've got nested values. All right, so I've got basically I'm defining a pod, very simple pod definition. API version v1, kind is pod, metadata. Now, under metadata, the value of the metadata is an array. Okay, it is an associative array of name equals pod example. This is the value of metadata. The value of spec is an associative, is an associative array of all of these name value pairs. Okay. And then the value of command is itself an array, not an associative array, but an array of just my script. Okay. Again, you can mix JSON in with YAML if you want to. Now, quick note, if you're familiar with containers, you're probably familiar with this notation where you have the image name colon version tag. This is perfectly fine because there's no space. This space here is mandatory for this reason. Okay, so you must put a space after the colon in order for this to work properly. Okay, now let's see. Does anybody have any questions on any of that so far? Okay, I'm going to
One
take that.
question for me, Nick.
Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit about the indentations of, if you look at the first one, like the metadata, and then the line below that name pod example, how many spaces do we have to provide for the name?
Yes. Okay, that's a very good question. So the answer is it doesn't matter as long as you are consistent. Okay, so you can put 2, you could put 1, you could put 4, you could put 17. It doesn't matter, but you must be consistent. So if you put 4 here, you must put 4 here as well. Okay.
Okay.
You can't kind of like, otherwise it thinks you're kind of like skipping levels. And here's the other thing you must know: you may not use tabs. Tabs are verboten. You cannot use tabs in here. Okay. Any other questions before we move on?
The chat,
Yeah.
would you like to take that?
Okay. Yes, please. Sure. If I can see what it is. Yes. Why doesn't it have a space? So the question was, why doesn't Ubuntu trusty have a space? And the answer is, this is not a name value pair. Okay. This is the name of the image, and the image is the Ubuntu image, the trusty tag version of the Ubuntu image. Okay, so this is not a name value pair. This is one single value right here. That's why. Any other questions? Okay, we'll move on. If you have questions, just throw them in the chat. All right. Moving right along. Sometimes you have more than one value for a name. So in this case, we have the name is SEO metadata, and you have multiple values. Each value is set off with a dash. Okay. Now you'll notice here we wrapped the line, and it's fine because we have the dash, so it's okay. These can also be indented, but they don't have to be, because the fact that it's got the dash there tells YAML that this is a sub value, that this is the value of SEO metadata. Okay. Now, if you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat as we go along. I'll be, Avinash, if you can keep an eye on that, I will be happy to answer as we go on.
There is one question
Okay.
in the comment section. So can we have comments added for understanding like in shell
We
script?
can indeed, and I will get there. Yes, there will be. Yes, there can be comments. So give me a minute. We'll get there. Um, we can also have. In fact, let's just go right to comments. See, told you we were getting there. You can do comments, as you can see here, with a pound sign or the hash symbol, however you want to express that. So yes, you absolutely can put in comments, and um, I strongly encourage comments as you go along. Um, the comments can be um, should be indented along with whatever they're commenting about. Okay. Coming back to where I was going before, you can have multiple objects in a single document. So you don't have to like create, 650 different files for one sort of project. I mean, obviously, you want things to be understandable. Um, but if you want, you can put multiple objects in a document by specifying this three dashes. So three dashes at the top tells YAML that a new object is coming. Now, this is important, okay? It's not at the bottom to say we're at the end of an object. It's at the top to say we're starting an object. So if you have more than one, you must start with this three dashes. Okay. All right. So we talked about comments. All right. So before we move into data types, any questions on format? Can you have blank lines? Yes, you can have blank lines. I don't understand the question, starting object require closure. So whoever said that, please give me a little bit more information. If you have only one object, do we still need the three dashes? No, you do not. All right. So you're very welcome. All right, moving right along. Data types. Now, even though this is just a bunch of strings, YAML does recognize actual data types such as strings, integers, and so on. And it has actually quite, as you can see here, a quite decent list of built-in data types, such as strings, maps, integers, and so on. And let's take a look at some of these. Now, before we do that, in order to do this, we're going to go ahead and install a Python program that will, well, not install, but we're going to use a Python program that will read a file of data, load it in, and then for each object, it's going to show us the name, the type of the object, and then the object itself. In order to do that, we need to give Python the ability to read YAML. So you want to use pip install pyyaml or pip3 install pyyaml, whatever is going to work for you. I actually have an old version of Python. I'm still working with Python 3.4, so it was a pain in the backside for me to get ready for this last night. I had to get a special version of pip, but that's beside the point. So you may have to, jump through a couple of hoops, but once you've jumped through the hoops, it's pretty straightforward. We're importing YAML and then doing everything that we need to do. So, if I have a file, and I do, let's see. So if I take, so I'm going to jump out of presentation mode here, so that I can copy and paste. So, I have here a file that has a list, a string, an integer. Let's see what happens when we run a Python what do we call it? Read YAML Python. Okay. Oh, you know what? You know what would happen? It would be better if I actually saved it to the file that it was reading. That's going to work much better. Let's try that again. There we go. Okay, so as you can see, just based on the formatting of what we have, Python is able to figure out what is going on. And I actually had an error here. All right, so like you can see, this is what I had. I had a dictionary, but it said class is none. There's no value, there's no anything. And the reason is because I had no spaces here. So if I were to go ahead and add these spaces in, fix that. Now let's run it again. Now it notices that we have a dictionary. Okay. So the fact that we had, so that's the first thing. Okay, you saw that those spaces really matter. That's first off. Second, notice that YAML was able to tell the difference between a floating point number and an integer based on the fact that I had decimals here. Okay. Does anybody have any questions on any of that? And Avinash, you're going to have to read them to me so I don't infinite window us.
I think we can move on. There are no questions at the moment.
No questions. Okay, great. So if I then go back to, here, so that's our first list. Now let's look at, I've got a second list of data types, and let's look at that one. Grab that and here. All right, now we have a different set of values. We got hex. You may recognize this. Octal, date, Boolean. Let's see how YAML handles these. So let's clear the first set and read the second set. Okay, so the first set we had was a hex value, okay, and YAML knew that this was hex based on 0x at the beginning. Okay, so a hex value of 4824 actually comes out to 18468. Okay, that's base 16. All right, so we have to, so you have to take that into consideration, but you're used to using hex numbers, I'm guessing. But this one here, this one is weird. Okay, it says it's an integer of a value 8. Well, let's see what we had. This is what we put in the first place. We said it was an octal number of 010. Well, what does that mean? Well, the same way that hex, the same way that it recognizes a hexagonal, hexadecimal number with 0x, YAML assumes that a number that starts with 0 is base 8. Okay, meaning that, you've got, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, whatever. So you see it translated this. And the reason that I bring this up is you're probably not going to accidentally put 0x at the beginning of a number, but you very well could have 0, a leading 0 at the beginning of a number. So be careful. Um, dates, it obviously recognizes the date value, as we can see here. Now, let's look at the Booleans for a minute. So there are different ways to specify Boolean. Okay, off, it recognized as false, so you can use on off. You can use true false. Okay, you can also use yes no depending on the version. Okay, so later versions, I forget whether it's later versions yes no works and earlier versions yes no is treated as a string or vice versa, I forget, but be aware that that is version dependent. And then you can turn a number into a string by enclosing it in quotes. So remember, before it recognized this as a float automatically, but by putting it in quotes, we can turn it into a string. Any questions on any of this? Again, Avinash, let me know.
So one question on strings. So what is
Okay.
a good practice for strings? Like no quotes, single quotes, or double quotes?
Um, it depends on what you're doing, really. It depends on the application. It depends on who's going to be reading it. Um, I personally, I like to have strings around my quotes just because I like it to jump out at me. But if you're trying to be brief, um, it's entirely up to you and the coding standards for your organization in a lot of ways. Now, there are some other things that we need to know about strings. Um, let's go back here. So, in fact, let's jump ahead.
There
Let's
is
jump
one more
ahead on
thing.
strings. Yeah,
Yes. What about alphanumeric? I think no strings for alphanumeric, right?
I don't understand the question. I'm sorry.
Okay. So for alphanumeric characters, do we provide codes or
Oh! You mean like Unicode things that are not necessarily ASCII characters?
yes? Hmm.
That is a good question. That is a good question. Um, I think, yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. I'll have to find out the answer to that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
definitely. We will follow up
Yeah,
with that information on the email
thank you.
with
Okay.
an FAQ.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, we'll include that. Yeah, I'll find out the answer and I'll let you know. But let's look here a little bit more about strings because um, sometimes sometimes you need to just include. We talked about, you're talking about going with or without quotes. Um, this is an example of blocks of text. I'm going to just kind of bring these over here so you can see them a little bit better. But these are blocks of text that go on for multiple lines. And you may not be able to fit everything on one line, so that's fine. So how do you deal with this? Well, there's two ways. Okay, one is using the greater than sign, in which case you get exactly what you put in. And the other is the pipe, which basically puts everything into one. So let's take a look at how this works if we run it. So, okay. The first, sorry, I take it back. It's the other way around. Take it back. So there are no modifications that go in here. with the greater than sign. Okay. So you can see here, greater than sign, it just put everything together. Um, and then with the pipe, it adds in um, the line breaks so that you get exactly what you're expecting. Okay. So those are two ways to handle strings, long strings. Okay. Questions on any of that before we move on?
So Nick, just to elaborate on that further, right? Can you
Mm-hmm.
provide a space on the example in the example section and like run the same run it?
Sure. So like that.
Yes.
Okay. Sure. Let's do that. Where's it?
It's on the top.
So yeah. So there it is. So what we see here is we got the line break. We got the line break, but we didn't get the actual. So let's see what happens if we do two, for the sake of argument. So yeah, so what we're getting is we're getting the line break. So we got one line break, two line breaks, but not necessarily the space. So we've got the characters themselves, but not necessarily the actual line break. So that's an interesting experiment right there. Any other questions? So you
Maybe
can
can
see
you
that.
just like quickly
Yeah.
summarize this? I think
Yes.
audience is asking to repeat, so just like quickly summarize this particular section one more time, and we can move on.
Yes. So so to summarize this section, basically we're looking at there are different ways to handle text. Let me back up. So YAML recognizes values, the types of values based on their format. Okay, there are still a couple of other data types that we can look at. For example, let's look at, you can actually specify the type that you want. So for example, in this case, we are saying we want a binary value, and we want this to be exactly like this. So maybe it's a key or something like that. We're going to say this is a float, even though it doesn't have a decimal point, and we're going to say this is an integer, even though it's in strings. It's in quotes. So if we run it, we can see we get the types that we wanted. So the summary basically is that YAML understands what we're doing, even though we're going along. All right. ConfigMap is technically a data type, but it's basically a YAML document. You can use a dot in these names, just so that you know. That's why I put that there. And you can pass, and a secret is a very important type of Kubernetes object, because this is how you should be using your usernames and passwords. Okay, you should not be hard coding them into anything. You should not be putting them into the YAML file that specifies your pod or anything like that. Okay, define yourself a secret, and let me make this bigger. Come on.
There is a zoom icon.
There we go.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go. Define yourself a secret, name it, and then use specify base64 data for the username and the password. So this kind of brings everything together that we did. Does anybody have any questions on that before we move on to tools?
Okay, no questions in the chat. We can move on.
Fabulous. Okay. Um, so that brings us to tools. So really, there are a ton of online tools that we can use for virtually anything at this point. Um, and I would encourage you to check these out. So if we were to go to, right here, it was the top, 208. It was 10,282. It changes all the time. Now it's 7,031 projects, but there's a lot out here. So um, you can get libraries for pretty much any language. So for example, I was using Python, um, but you can get them for pretty much anything. I don't think that there's any language that doesn't have a library for YAML at this point. Um, there was a guy who actually ran Kubernetes on COBOL because he was able to get a YAML library for COBOL. There are lots of online tools, converters, back and forth YAML to JSON to XML, and so on. I strongly encourage you to get yourself a good YAML validator because it's easy to get an extra space here and there and so on. Um, and Atom.io is a great tool for all kinds of text manipulation, and now you can use YAML with it. Anyway, that's the basics. So I'm gonna stop sharing my whole screen so I can come and see the questions. Does anybody have any other questions?
There are no additional questions in the chat.
Okay. Right. So that brings us to we're 4 minutes. Okay, here we go. Password you were showing will keep in YAML. So yeah. So let me go back to that tab. So yeah. So the password that I was showing here. So this is not the actual password. This is a base 64 representation of the password. Okay, so you would base 64 it, put it in here, and then this YAML document, you would keep this secure, like in Vault or someplace like that, and then reference it from your and then you would reference it from your pod so that you don't have to put the password directly into your YAML file, your other YAML file. Yes, we'll show the recording. Okay. Any other questions before we close up?
Okay, Nick, can you go to like the next slides after Q&A, which talks about the upcoming sessions?
Oh, I was not aware. Sorry, hold on. Okay, we're hiring. Okay, we're hiring. There we go. And upcoming talks. Fabulous.
Okay,
All right.
these are our upcoming talks. So the next Tuesday, we'll be sharing more insights on CI/CD with Kubernetes, where we'll be talking about, where Kevin will be talking about CI/CD best practices, like different approaches that are available in CI/CD, and talk about different frameworks like ClickOps and then the GitOps frameworks within CI/CD. And the following week, which is on June 21st, we will deep dive into the GitOps framework of implementing the CD part in the Kubernetes. So it is done by Sukesh and Pratik, like our DevOps engineers in the PS team. So please join us for the upcoming sessions.
All right. Fabulous.
All
All
right.
right.
Uh, with that, thank you, everyone. We will be, can you send the link for 21 session?
For the session on the 21st.
Oh, yes, sure. Like, in the email that you're going to receive as a follow-up, the email will be sent, you'll receive it by like Thursday. We will include all the information like FAQ and like recording link and the link to the slides as well as the upcoming sessions.
All right. Fabulous.
All right. With
Okay.
that, thank you, everyone. Thank you,
Thank you
Nick,
all.
for joining us. Yep. Thank you so
Thanks.
much. All
Bye
right.
bye.
Bye.